I found out. My boss was taking credit for my work, so I made sure the board knew the truth. For years, I prided myself on being a team player at work. I worked hard, stayed late, and went above and beyond to make sure my projects were top-notch. But nothing could have prepared me for the betrayal I uncovered. My boss was taking credit for my work, presenting my ideas as their own to the board. It was infuriating and humiliating, but instead of letting it slide, I came up with a plan to make sure everyone knew the truth. It all started during a quarterly meeting. I had spent weeks preparing a presentation on a new marketing strategy that I was certain would make a big impact. My boss, Mr. Daniels, asked to review it before the meeting, which I didn't think twice about. After all, he was my boss, and that's how things usually went. When the day of the meeting arrived, I was ready to present. But as I sat in the conference room, I noticed something strange. Mr. Daniels stood up, took my slides, and started presenting them as his own. He didn't just gloss over the fact that I had created the strategy. He didn't mention me at all. I believe this approach will, and my team has developed, felt like a slap in the face. I sat there, stunned, as the board members nodded along, impressed by his insight. I wanted to speak up, but I didn't want to seem unprofessional or petty. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, I told myself. Maybe he just forgot to mention me. But as the weeks went on, it became clear this wasn't a one-time thing. Every time I submitted a report, strategy, or idea, Mr. Daniels would conveniently forget to credit me, and every time, he got all the praise. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was just part of the job, I thought. Managers take credit for their team's work all the time, right? But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore. It wasn't just the presentations. Whenever my projects brought in results, whether it was a successful campaign or a boost in sales, Mr. Daniels would send out company-wide emails celebrating the achievement, without a single mention of my name. I'd hear colleagues congratulate him in the hallway, saying things like, "Great job, Dan, you really nailed it." Meanwhile, I was the one staying late, brainstorming ideas and running the numbers. What made it worse was that Mr. Daniels never gave me feedback or acknowledgement behind the scenes either. It was like my contributions didn't exist. I started to feel invisible, like all my hard work was for nothing. Then came the tipping point. One day, during another meeting, Mr. Daniels unveiled a long-term strategy I'd been developing for months. Not only did he present it as his own, but he also got a round of applause from the board for his innovative thinking. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding or bad communication. It was deliberate. I left that meeting feeling sick to my stomach. It wasn't just my ideas he was taking credit for. It was my career, and I knew I couldn't let it continue. After that meeting, I went back to my desk, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to storm into Mr. Daniels' office and confront him, but I knew that wouldn't accomplish anything. He was a smooth talker, the kind of boss who could spin any situation to his advantage. If I called him out without proof, he'd probably just brush me off, or worse, retaliate. So I decided to take a different approach. If Mr. Daniels was going to keep taking credit for my work, I'd make sure there was a clear trail leading back to me. I started documenting everything: emails, drafts, brainstorming notes, even timestamps. Every idea, report, or presentation I worked on had my name on it, and I kept copies saved in a private folder. I also started subtly sharing my work with trusted colleagues before handing it over to Mr. Daniels. I'd casually mention my ideas during coffee breaks or forward an early draft to someone in another department just to establish a wider record of my contributions. It wasn't easy. Every time Mr. Daniels stole credit for something, it stung. But I reminded myself that this was part of the plan. I wasn't just waiting for him to slip up. I was laying the groundwork for when he inevitably did. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One of my strategies was implemented, and it worked even better than projected. The board called for a follow-up presentation to discuss expanding the idea, and Mr. Daniels, as usual, volunteered to take the lead. This time, though, I was ready. When I heard about the follow-up presentation, I knew this was my chance to expose the truth. Mr. Daniels had been coasting on my work for months, but this project was different. It was complex, detailed, and relied heavily on insights only I could explain. If he tried to wing it, he'd crash and burn. In the days leading up to the meeting, I worked quietly in the background, refining the details of the strategy and preparing for any questions the board might ask. I also made sure to update my documentation, adding even more proof that the idea had originated with me. This included email threads with timestamps, collaborative notes, and internal reports. The real stroke of genius, though, was an idea that came to me late one night. I included a few key details in the strategy that were intentionally vague, points that only I could clarify. If Mr. Daniels tried to present my work, he'd inevitably hit a wall, forcing him to either admit he didn't know the answers or make something up on the spot. The morning of the presentation, I walked into the conference room feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. Mr. Daniels gave me a tight-lipped smile as I sat down, clearly confident he was about to wow the board yet again. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I was ready for what was about to unfold. The meeting began as usual, with Mr. Daniels confidently taking the floor. He launched into the presentation using the slides I had created, word for word. For the first few minutes, everything went smoothly. The board members nodded along, impressed by what they were hearing. But then he hit one of the intentional gaps I'd built into the strategy, a section that required detailed knowledge of a specific data set. He hesitated, scanning the slide for answers that weren't there. One of the board members, Mr. Cartwright, raised a hand. "Can you elaborate on how these figures were calculated? It's an interesting approach, but I'd like to understand the methodology." I watched as Mr. Daniels' confident facade cracked. Well, he began, fumbling for words. "The team used some advanced analytics to reach these conclusions. It's all in the report." Mr. Cartwright wasn't buying it. "I've read the report, but it doesn't detail the process. Could you clarify?" The room grew silent, all eyes on Mr. Daniels. I could see the panic creeping into his expression. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. Finally, after a long, awkward pause, he turned to me. "Perhaps my name can explain this part. They were involved in the initial stages of the project." I took a deep breath and stood up. "Actually," I began, keeping my tone professional, "I was responsible for developing the entire strategy, including the analytics and projections. I'd be happy to walk you through the details." The shift in the room was palpable. The board members leaned forward, intrigued, while Mr. Daniels sat back, his face pale. As I stepped to the front of the room, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was my chance to finally claim credit for my work, and I wasn't going to waste it. I opened the report and began explaining the methodology in detail, breaking it down step by step. The board members were engaged, nodding and taking notes as I spoke. Mr. Cartwright even interrupted to say, "This is exactly what I was hoping to hear. Excellent work, my name." When I finished, another board member asked about the potential scalability of the strategy. I answered confidently, referencing additional projections I'd prepared but hadn't included in the initial presentation, information only I had access to. By the time I wrapped up, the energy in the room had completely shifted. It was clear to everyone that I was the true architect of the project. Mr. Daniels sat in awkward silence, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Mr. Cartwright turned to him and said, "Dan, it seems like my name was deeply involved in this project. Why weren't they the one presenting today?" Mr. Daniels stammered, trying to come up with an answer, but I could see the board wasn't buying it. After the meeting ended, several board members approached me directly, praising my work and asking follow-up questions. Mr. Daniels tried to slink out of the room unnoticed, but not before Mr. Cartwright called him aside for a private word. The moment the meeting ended, word about what had happened began to spread. My colleagues, who had always known I worked hard but never realized the extent of Mr. Daniels' behavior, started coming up to me with questions and congratulations. "That was impressive," one coworker said. "Honestly, I always wondered why he got so much credit for the work you were doing." I kept my responses polite but brief, still processing everything that had unfolded. Meanwhile, Mr. Daniels avoided eye contact with me for the rest of the day. I could tell he was nervous about what the board's reaction would be, and he had every right to be. A few days later, I was called into a meeting with Mr. Cartwright and a couple of other board members. They wanted to discuss my contributions in more detail, as well as the broader dynamics in the department. I explained my role in the project and mentioned, carefully but honestly, that this wasn't the first time I'd seen my work presented without acknowledgement. The board members didn't seem surprised. "We've noticed some inconsistencies," Mr. Cartwright said. "But today's presentation made things very clear. Your work stands out, and we want to ensure you're being recognized appropriately." I left that meeting feeling a mix of relief and triumph. For months, I'd been sidelined and silenced, but now my voice was finally being heard. The next day, a company-wide email went out announcing that I'd been promoted to a senior position within the department. The message specifically highlighted my contributions to the project, giving me the credit I'd worked so hard for. The day after my promotion was announced, the atmosphere in the office shifted. People congratulated me in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward Mr. Daniels' office. He hadn't been seen all morning, and whispers about his fate were spreading like wildfire. By lunch, the rumors were confirmed. Mr. Daniels had been called into a meeting with the board and was asked to step down from his role. An email from HR later explained that he had chosen to pursue other opportunities, but left out the messy details. Everyone in the office knew better. While I didn't take pleasure in his downfall, I couldn't deny the sense of justice I felt. For months, he had taken credit for work he didn't do, silencing my efforts and stealing opportunities. Now, he was the one paying the price for his actions. In the days that followed, I was asked to take over some of Mr. Daniels' responsibilities temporarily, while the company decided on a replacement. It was a lot of work, but it felt empowering to finally be in control of my own projects without someone else overshadowing me. Even more satisfying was the respect I began receiving from my colleagues and the board. People who had overlooked me before started recognizing my potential, asking for my input on major decisions, and trusting me to lead initiatives. It was like a weight had been lifted, and I was finally free to shine. With Mr. Daniels gone, the department felt like a completely different place. I no longer had to watch my back or worry about my work being stolen. Instead, I could focus on doing what I loved, developing strategies, mentoring junior employees, and contributing to the company's growth. As I settled into my new role, I made it a point to create a culture of transparency and recognition. I encouraged my team to share their ideas openly and made sure to credit them for their contributions in meetings and reports. I didn't want anyone to feel the way I had under Mr. Daniels' leadership. One of the most rewarding moments came a few weeks later when a junior employee approached me after a team meeting. "I just wanted to say thank you," they said. "It means a lot that you gave me credit for my part in the project. I've never had a boss do that before." Hearing that made all the stress and frustration of the past few months worth it. I realized that while I couldn't undo what had happened to me, I could use my experience to make things better for others. Meanwhile, the board continued to show their support. I was included in high-level discussions and given opportunities to lead initiatives I'd only dreamed of before. It felt like all my hard work was finally being recognized, and I was determined not to take it for granted. Looking back, I never would have imagined that exposing Mr. Daniels would lead to so many changes, not just for me, but for the entire department. What started as an infuriating betrayal turned into an opportunity to prove my worth and reshape my career. The experience taught me the importance of standing up for myself, even when it felt daunting. It would have been easier to stay quiet, to let Mr. Daniels keep taking credit for my work, but I knew that wasn't sustainable. By documenting everything and waiting for the right moment, I was able to reveal the truth in a way that left no room for doubt. It also reminded me of the value of transparency and recognition in the workplace. I'd seen firsthand how damaging it could be to have your efforts ignored, and I vowed to never let that happen under my leadership. I wanted my team to know their contributions mattered, just like I wished I'd known mine did. Now, I'm thriving in my role, working on projects that challenge and excite me. The board continues to show their confidence in me, and my colleagues respect me in a way they never did before. Best of all, I feel like I've finally reclaimed my career. It's mine, not something someone else can take credit for. Have you ever had someone take credit for your hard work? How did you handle it? And what did you learn from the experience? Share your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear how others have navigated similar challenges. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories about resilience, justice, and finding your voice. Thanks for watching.